I was trained as an African historian. I got my PhD at Northwestern University back in the dark ages of the 1980s, and I was trained as a Southern African historian. I lived in Mozambique during the heady days of the anti-apartheid movement, which was very, very important period for me in my development. Um, but I've always been interested in the African diaspora and connections in the African diaspora. And one of the things that's so interesting that's actually happened is when I went to undergrad and grad school, we couldn't study the African diaspora. And it's hard to believe. There had been a gap between the era of W.E.B. Du Bois and that period of the 1940s, 30s and 40s, and all of that kind of Pan-African connection, and the coming of the Cold War and the formal establishment of African studies programs in places like the University of Wisconsin and Northwestern in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And there was a distinct determination to separate African Americans from connecting with Africa through scholarship. And in fact, Du Bois and Herskovits had a huge debate back in the day about this very issue, just so you know. Um, so it's interesting because I see myself actually as a forerunner in some ways, because I couldn't study the diaspora in graduate school, but I could self-study once I got out. And that's exactly what I decided to do, because it was important for me to see the connections in the world. It's important to focus on a particular place, and I did that with Southern Africa. Then I began to do some focus on Cuba and African Americans. So my three locations in terms of having some level of expertise are those three areas: African American history, Cuban history, and Southern Africa in the context of the African diaspora. Which means when I look at Cuba, I tend to focus on people of African descent and that particular history in Cuba. So I say all that just so you have a sense of who I am. Um, I should tell you that this is a very preliminary work in progress. I told Dante when I had the idea of talking about slave badges, South African apartheid passes, and the current document question for so-called illegal aliens in the United States. Um, I had hoped to have a lot more time to actually theorize and think about it on a certain kind of level. So I'm going to approach this. I have a lot of visuals, I have some information, and I'd love all of your help. I told Rhonda this, in helping me think through this connection. Because of course what I'm doing here is, this is not an African diaspora project per se, because I'm looking at African American history, I'm looking at South African history, and then I'm also looking at Mexican labor in the United States. So I'm even broadening that out in terms of thinking about what Vijay Prashad said, the history of the darker nations and darker peoples, and how we connect in a broader so-called third world and transnational perspective, especially as it relates to race and people of color. So, so this is a work in progress, and it started with a new book project that I'm doing now that's looking at radical black dock workers in Charleston, South Carolina, and Havana, Cuba. And I'm interested in this because it came to my attention that both places had, their dock workers were majority black in both places in the mid-19th century. That's who was working on the docks. They also were very radical in that in the United States, they had an action literally in 1867 in Charleston. Just 2 years after the end of the Civil War, they are striking on the docks in Charleston. So I was like, these are some bad folks. They're barely free, and they are striking on the docks of Charleston. And so I began to look at the history of Charleston and the history of that dock worker culture. And it opened up a lot of things for me. Similarly in Cuba, the dock workers in Havana and the port of Havana, which is an area that's like a bay. Um, the majority of folks there were also black. They were slave and free, simultaneously working side by side before the end of slavery. And they had a very cosmopolitan view. And I've even found and realized that actually ships from Havana went to Charleston quite often, and vice versa in terms of the delivery of goods. And I've begun to look for more and more sailor contact, reading material, literature contacts between the two places. So, but I'm just on the precipice of this. Dr. Rhonda and I were talking about being directors of institutes and trying to do scholarship at the same time. It can actually be quite challenging, but we love it, so we do our best. So in looking at Charleston, I realized that Charleston was the only place that actually required urban slaves in Charleston to wear slave badges. Um, and I'm going to show you a little bit of a picture of that in a minute, of some of the badges. South Carolina was the richest of the 13 colonies before the American Revolution. Rice was its primary commodity during that time. And it also, for most of that time, had a black majority. It's the only state that actually had a black majority, 65, 67%. At its lowest, between, say, 1670, when the first uh, blacks were brought there from Barbados, they might have been 40 and whites 60, then it was 50 and 50. By 1860, it was something like 70% of South Carolina was black. Interestingly, they produced a lot of rice, and they were very strategic about who they brought to South Carolina. They actually brought slaves from the Senegambia region in Senegal and advertised for that, who actually brought their skill of growing rice. They had tried to grow rice in the marshlands in Charleston in what's called the Low Country for many years, and it wasn't until they began to bring increased numbers in 1700, 1710 of slaves from West Africa who they knew, and I don't know if you all are aware of the new scholarship, is that slaves were never brought to the Americas as unskilled, huddled masses. They were brought to the Americas. Often the advertisements were based on knowledge of what skills they had and where they were from. So the iron work in New Orleans, the iron work in Charleston, they would advertise, if they wanted that work, they would advertise for Africans from Benin. They wanted rice production, they'd advertise for Africans from Senegambia. So the new scholarship is really pointing this out. So South Carolina became the richest colony. And as one student said to me, really interesting, she said she had a teacher who told her that this point, that South Carolina was the richest colony. And she said, is that because they had the most slaves? Because they had the most property. And this particular professor hadn't quite made that connection. So it wasn't just what the slaves produced, it's that the slaves, in fact, were property. And so, yes, it is a connection there. So Charleston developed as a rice producing area, was known all over the world for producing rice. And these are some of the lithographs and images from that period. This is actually rice that still comes out of South Carolina. It's called Plantation rice. But by the early 1820s, 1830s, they had begun to diversify more in terms of what they produced, and actually more cotton, more timber, and those kind of things began to come out of Charleston. And I'm not completely sure why yet, but I think it's because the market in Europe between China and other areas of rice production in the East were further developed. So this is actually a lithograph by Elizabeth Alston Pringle from 1845, and it's really interesting. It says, and tied into sheaves with which the Negroes do very skillfully with a wisp of the rice itself. But the other interesting thing about Charleston is that it also was the most bustling port for a time during the antebellum period um, before 1787. And in fact, this Charleston market was built in 1739, and it was a place of tremendous activity. Um, all manner of vessels called at the city. They hauled cargo from throughout the world. In 1768, there were 448 vessels entered the harbor, and by 18 in 1768, 448 vessels. By 1848, there were nearly 2,000 vessels that came there from all over the world. So it was a huge, bustling, important port in American history. One of the things that's so interesting about this, and if you see this picture here, is that with South Carolina being a majority black space, Charleston, downtown Charleston, the port and the surrounding areas was almost all black, all slave. And when you read some of the accounts of Europeans coming to the port in the 1700s and late 1700s, they would say, are we in Africa or are we in America? And so what was happening is that most of the plantations tended to be away from the port, and they grew rice, then they grew cotton, they grew all the foodstuffs for South Carolina. But the planters rarely engaged, the owners rarely engaged in commercial activity. They thought that that was something that they couldn't go to town to sell their wares. That was something that was beneath them. So they would send their slaves. So literally slaves in the 1700s, early 1800s, and then some free because slaves used the money they made to buy their freedom, ran Charleston. And it's so interesting when you read these accounts. It's because these slaves, this is the way the system worked. Slave women often were in the market. And in fact, I don't know if is this a pointer too? Yeah. Here, there's a black child. There's a black woman back here. It was known clearly, speaking of race and place, it was clearly known as a black woman's space. Black women were the ones that often came with the goods to sell on behalf of their owner to downtown Charleston. And I was going to read to you the Gazette. The Charleston Gazette in 1772 said almost every day inside and outside the market, poultry, fruit, eggs, peas, all brought thither from the country for sale. Near the market constantly resort a great number of loose, idle, and disorderly Negro wenches who are seated there from morn till night and buy and sell on their own accounts what they please in order to pay their wages and get so much more for themselves as they can. For their owners care little how their slaves get the money. They, in fact, these wenches, hoard as they see fit to strengthen their earnings. So what was happening in Charleston is these women would make a deal, these slave women would make a deal with their owner that we're going to sell these products and this is the amount of money you're going to make based on the market price today. So let's say that's $100, right, for what they've got. They would go to town, they would negotiate and sell and hoard and buy from the dock workers who were also all slaves and sell to the white citizens who needed the food to live at whatever price they wanted. They literally controlled the food source of Charleston. There's a lot of complaints about how these slave women control the food source, and there's worry that what if they decide to do something? But for the owners, they had plantation slaves, but then they also had slaves that went to market. So for them, it was making money. And so one of the things that I'm interested in is this kind of contradiction between a desire to make profit and a desire to control. right? So is it the market or is it whiteness? But then in some ways they go together, because if in fact you give these women too many rights and don't control them, then they will compete with the very owners that own them if they had the ability to buy land and all of that. So it's a very um, interesting situation that was happening in Charleston. This is a very bad lithograph. When I pulled it up, I was trying to find some from the period. But the majority of dock workers were also slave men and free, and they were also hired out. And also this happened with also off seasons. In various plantations would have off seasons for what they were producing when the harvest came in or when it was a downtime. And so they would hire out their slaves to work on the dock. So they did everything. Men did everything on the dock, from lifting, hauling, running canoes or small boats between the big ships into the bay, because if the big ships couldn't come in, um, they did a lot. They did a lot. Um, this is another story from 1712, which begins to talk about the need to control these loose, unruly slaves in downtown Charleston. And again, it's an interesting situation because the owners are pushing for the laws along with whites who live downtown who are offended by the blacks' ability to seem to be free and to do whatever they want. But on the other hand, the owners still continue to send their people to town because they need that money, and they hire them out. It was a great way to make money. You hire out your slave to a dock owner, to work there. And then, of course, what would also happen is that the dock worker would work there and then hire himself out somewhere else before he went back to the plantation. So there was no system of control once you let the slaves go in. Well, clearly they were skilled craftsmen. They were mechanics, they were porters, they were butchers, they were carpenters, they were leather tanners, they were mechanics, um, they were iron workers, they were goldsmiths, they were silversmiths, all of that. So clearly, whether or not they all, yeah, business, they were business savvy. And one of the things that's so interesting is that there's a link between West African markets and what happened in Charleston. I don't know if any of you all have been to Accra or Dakar. Um, huh? Yeah, I mean, them sisters, you get up in there, you're not going to get a good bargain. Um, they were part of the resistance to colonialism, market women. In fact, Fela Kuti, the musician, his mother was a major market woman in Nigeria who resisted the British colonialism and mobilized the women in the market. So there's some speculation as to how women ended up, kind of being loose and idle, how their masters let them go to town, but they were actually pretty good at it. Not pretty good, very good. They were good at selling the product, bringing the money back, and a lot of them probably had deals with their masters. I probably can make even a little more if you let me make a little more on the side, and that seems to have happened quite a bit. Yeah. So there was clearly a large skill set of folks. So here is where you begin to see the beginning of trying to control. 1712, whereas several owners of slaves this is a law, used their said slaves to work where they please upon condition that their said slaves do bring their aforesaid masters so much money. It is hereby enacted that said slaves shall have a ticket of permission. Okay, they're worried about folks moving around. by 1722, they added to this that informers of slaves moving around without a ticket will be paid 5 shillings for reporting said slaves. But they were in a big contradiction because, as I said, the owners kept sending them, kept hiring them out. The local townspeople depended on them for food. um, there was a relationship between the dock workers who knew all the stuff coming in and when it was coming, and the women's ability to put some to the side until everybody needed it. I mean, very, very smart relations downtown. Um, and it's so interesting because so I didn't put all of the legal laws that were put in place moving towards badges. There was something in Charleston almost every few months trying to figure out how to control this situation and also how to tax it and make some money. So owners were then also fined if some of their slaves were downtown without a ticket. And so then you had owners doing things like this, telling people, I sent them to be a carpenter at so-and-so's shop, let's say a man. If you see him running around and you're a carpenter, don't hire him because he doesn't have a ticket to be with you. He has a ticket to where I sent him to. So in 1772, you would see these kinds of ads. David Rhine took out an ad. All persons in general, but in particular, cabinet makers, house carpenters, and joiners, not to employ at any time without his knowledge, that is David Rhymes, and consent first obtained, his Negro man named York. Otherwise, they may be assured of being prosecuted as far as the laws and justice will support him. So basically, he's saying, my guy York is downtown. He's supposed to be doing one thing, don't hire him. So by 1805, you have the first badges. City badges for the year 1805. Notice is hereby given to the owners or representatives of such slaves as are working out on hire within the city, that the city treasurer will commence issuing badges for the year 1805 on the first Monday in January next. So this was put out by the city treasurer. And these are some of the badges. And as far as we know, other slave areas had passes and tickets for slaves to move around, but Charleston was the only one that had these badges, which they were to affix, I guess with that, maybe with a wire through their shirt or something with that hole. And if you see, it's so interesting because there's often a year in which they were made and a number. So the city would issue so many. So that top one is 1824. That slave was a mechanic. And he was the 103rd person to get a badge. 109, this is a fruiterer, a person who sold fruit. 1815, this is a servant, and this is a porter, someone who moved goods at the dock. So as you'll see, one of the things I'm going to continue to move through is this idea of control and regulation and a kind of contradiction between wanting the money that this cheap labor source can offer you, but not wanting that labor to be free enough to move around, make their own money, have rights to challenge that relationship. And so badging and tagging is a way to kind of keep up with the separation between who has rights and who does not. You know, that's interesting because I think it was a little bit of both. I think you had a lot of runaways as well. I mean, you know, you get to send these folks, you know, down to the city. And in fact, there were scandalous runaways in Charleston. There was literally a runaway who lived 3 years selling stuff in downtown Charleston and nobody did anything. And everybody knew him. Everybody knew him. So it was kind of an interesting nod. And then also a lot of the whites who complained about the monopoly that these women had over food still had to buy food from them because you didn't have a lot of small farmers at this time. You had big plantations, and generally they dominated the food market. Now, of course, as time goes on, some of that changes. So in 1806, I thought this was interesting. This is basically the law that it tells you basically how much for each job category. So back to your question, young gentleman back there, he's not looking. One of the things I think we have this idea about slavery and about this period is that Africans were unskilled, that whites didn't know that they didn't use those skills. And we know all over the South, when slavery ended, the vast majority of skilled labor before the coming of Jim Crow laws, blacks basically were the skilled laborers. And it wasn't until laws came into being that said you can't hire a black before a white that we began to see that kind of unemployment and switch. But during slavery on plantations, Africans were the skilled labor to do everything. Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, if you own someone and they have a skill, are you going to work with them or are you going to hire somebody? So it's interesting. So this says, be it noticed for each badge, the several sums shall be respectfully paid. For butcher, 40 shillings. For a carpenter, bricklayer, fisherman, blacksmith, wheelwright, pump or black maker, cabinet maker, painter or glazier, and gold or silversmith, 20 shillings. For tailor, tin man, tanner, or curer, 15 shillings. For a mariner, cooper, shoemaker, barber, hatter, rope maker, or any other handicrafts tradesman, 10 shillings for the said badge. I know, I know. It's an interesting spot. Good question. I'll put that down since I'm doing my workshop here. Um, so this is it's called Jim Crow segregation. Yeah, that flip, that total flip. Yeah. So it's not about. It's often when I think about U.S. history, I often try to remind people that these kinds of systems of segregation, of power relations, of access to employment, they had to happen. They didn't have, they had to be done by law, by pressure, by force. They didn't happen naturally. So it's not like Africans, it's not like black people um, sort of just didn't have the skills and now they're working hard to get in. We had the skills and we were pushed out. Same thing with baseball. I always tell my students, baseball had to be segregated. It wasn't segregated in 1870, 80, 1900. It wasn't until the teams that Kennesaw Landis actually decided to segregate baseball. Interesting note. This is an image of this is actually an image in Maryland, but it's an image of what became known as slave patrols. you had groups of whites that were then empowered to stop slaves if they were moving around, uh, and they needed to know if, in fact, they had a badge or a ticket. This is actually from Charles County, Maryland, but it was the only picture that I had of a slave patrol that I could put my hand on for this talk. So, so you then begin to have, so you have the tickets, you have the passes, you have the badges, you have increased regulation, and then you have patrols, which are sort of like small militias who are armed by the city, usually, and given the ability to do this. Sometimes they were hired by groups of owners. Sometimes there were the owners, or sometimes they were paid by, they were local working class whites who were paid by the city to do these kinds of patrols. So this is a patrol notice, actually from North Carolina, but I thought that it's interesting to kind of look at it. It says to Elijah W. Day, Justice of the Peace for Charles County, the undersigned think a patrol necessary for the neighborhood lying between Zakia Swamp on the east and Clark Swamp on the west, and between the road leading from Port Tobacco to Piney Church on the north. And so 3 people signed it. And then the Justice of the Peace says, by virtue of the above application, I hereby appoint Josiah, group of men, and Elijah Day, the Justice of the Peace, signs it. At the end, you see what they're supposed to do. The captains of the above patrol wish it to be distinctly understood that any Negro who may be caught from home after night without a pass from his owner will be severely dealt with. So increased regulation. They would, sometimes they were ads in newspapers. Yeah. Um, and this is just another one which I think is interesting because it brings up the issue of curfew and the issue of the contradiction. So slaves residing in the country whose owners, masters, or mistresses for the time being do not live in town other than such as have wives in town shall not come to town on the Sabbath day unless to attend church or in the nighttime without written permission from their owners, masters, or mistresses for the time being, such permission stating the place or places such slaves shall visit. This other paragraph is interesting. Provided that they may at all times come to town on the business of their owners, masters, or mistresses for the time being without written permission. Want to control, but the owners probably made sure that that was in there so that they could send their folks when they needed. A bit of a contradiction. Then you have a curfew. No slave after the hour of 9, a reasonable time being allowed for him or her to go home or to the place designated in his or her written permission after the ringing of the bell shall be on the streets or absent from the premises of his or her owner, master, or mistress. Rule 3, if any slave shall violate the foregoing rules, the patrol shall have power, and it shall be their duty, any 2 of their number being present, to whip the said slave, either at the time of the offense being committed or at any time within 3 months thereafter, the number of stripes not to exceed 15, unless the said slave shall be guilty of insolent behavior or make his escape from the patrol, in either of which cases the number of stripes shall not exceed 39. So these are plantation police badges. They actually had badges, slave patrols. Um, Often they were used to catch runaway slaves, but these were also the ones that were used to police and check if, in fact, you were legal or illegal in the place that you were supposed to be. Yes, yes. Okay, so now I want to turn to another place. This is what I've been, this is where I'm kind of trying to make some leaps and thinking about how these things connect. So when I say slave badges, apartheid passes and then docks here. We're going to look at some of the dock laws too. Apartheid pass laws of 1952 required black South Africans over the age of 18 to carry a passbook everywhere and at all times. The reference book contained pages of an individual's fingerprints, photograph, personal details of employment, permission from the government to be in a particular part of the country, qualifications to work or seek work in the area, and an employer's reports on the worker performance and behavior. If a worker displeased their employer, the worker's right to stay in the area was jeopardized. I think it's very interesting because apartheid South Africa had a very similar dilemma. They wanted black labor. They wanted to maximize the profits for them, but they didn't want them to be free to live and work alongside of whites in the city. Yet they had to be in proximity with whites in order to work, right? And so I think it's very interesting that here we go from 1840 to 1952 and the same kind of form of controlling labor in order to maximize their exploitation, because controlling means that in South Africa, the idea was that every single black was simply a labor unit. I don't know if you all know South African history, which means that you could only come to the area you were working if you were working there. Similar to the slaves. They could only be in Charleston if they were there by permission of their owner. A little different, but similar. The similar tagging, marking, regulating, controlling. And all of that was done to deny equal rights. Right? Equal rights. Oh, I want to go back. The Group Areas Act basically had a curfew too. All blacks must be in an African area after 9 p.m. by the ring of a bell. I thought this sign was interesting. These are some of the anti-pass campaigns, and it said, "With passes, we are slaves." So they understood the kind of connection. And this is an image of a man who was holding up that pass book that I mentioned. I don't know if you all know South African history, but this is going to connect now with what happened with Mexican labor here in a kind of different twist, but similar in terms of control. This is South Africa, and in 1913, they passed the first Native Land Act that basically said whites would get 87% of the population and blacks would get 13% the land. And there were forcible removals to make that happen, starting in 1913, and then after 1950, sort of reconstituting it into what they called Bantustans, or homelands based on ethnic groups. And they did that because the ethnic groups were organizing together. So the idea is you don't just put them all in one area of different ethnic groups. You separate them and make it illegal for one ethnic group to live in another Bantustan. But I want you to keep in mind that the population of South Africa, about 10% was white. 90% was black, Indian, and colored. Yet they do the complete opposite in terms of who has rights to access to the land. And they did that in order to, any idea? My gentleman back there. Colonize the resources. And one of the things that was so interesting, South Africa was built on diamonds and gold. Right? Diamonds and gold were found in South Africa in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. As De Beers says, a diamond is forever. And I don't know if you all know, but De Beers comes from South Africa and made everybody involved in De Beers very, 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 very rich, very, very early. J.P. Morgan of Morgan Guaranteed Trust was one of the primary buyers of gold stock in 1917 and owned the lion's share. His Anglo-American cooperation owned the lion's share of gold production in South Africa. There's a lot of detail with that I won't go into. But what's so interesting about that is when diamonds and gold were found in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s in South Africa, Africans, the Zulu, the Xhosa, the Sotho, they had to be defeated by the British colonial armies, okay? Because as long as they were able to live on their land, they were not going to the mines, okay? They just, I mean, who's going to do that? Who's going to go 2 miles on the earth, you know, to get tuberculosis and die for a meager wage when you can actually live off your land like you had done for many, many years? And one of the other myths is that that Africa suffered from drought before Europeans got there. There was I did research on Mozambique and South Africa in the 19th century. There was no famine. There was no drought. They had huge silos of food. And I'll give you one example. When they conquered the Ndebele up north, up here in Zimbabwe, the British confiscated 237,000 heads of cattle. They were rich. They were rich. And so the Africans, so anyway, they didn't have the Gatling gun, which the British had developed in the mid-19th century, which was an early version of a machine gun. So they finally defeated the Zulus, not without a big battle. They finally defeated the Zulus, and they gained control over the land. What do Africans do? They respond in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s to the coming of Europeans and expand production of food. Because these new European immigrants, they don't know how to work this land. They're coming there because they're engineers, they're working the mines. So all around Johannesburg, all around Kimberley, they are literally expanding production to feed and to participate in this new world, right? 1913, they passed the Native Land Act because as long as they were making money, they were not going to go into the cheap labor, okay? And so that's also, they want to colonize the resources, but they also want to colonize the labor. And so the British and the white Boers or Afrikaners had a deal after they had had the Boer War. Afrikaners would take over the land and become large-scale agricultural producers, and the British would be primarily centered in British and mining capital. You know, it's funny. I don't see the anxiety there as much. What I see is a desire for them to be workers. And as long as they were able to feed themselves, that wasn't going to work. And they need, I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of workers that are needed for these mines. And I'm going to give you an example. The gold in South Africa is a 90-mile reef, deep underground. So right under Johannesburg. So what that means is they need workers to do dynamite, I mean, it's just a lot. And there was also a lot of casualties. And I should also tell you so do you know what I mean by a reef? So literally under the earth, there's a vein that snakes, and it's gold. Sometimes it's really deep, sometimes it's a little closer, but to get it, you got to get down there to get it. And it was so expensive, actually, to get the gold that no one sort of financial sector in the world could do it. So French, German, British, and American banks invested and bought up parts of that reef in order to make it possible. And then they found it, believe it or not, 1880s, Johannesburg had the only stock exchange in Africa. And a chamber of mines where all of the mine owners collectively got together so they wouldn't be competing with each other for labor. British also had a problem with the white Afrikaners. They had to give them something in order to have a kind of white white solidarity, because the British had come in and kind of dislocated them too. They had been there before from the 1600s. And so they got the land, British got the mines, Africans were going to be workers. Yeah. So early on, I didn't see the anxiety. You see the anxiety later as apartheid, as they want, in fact, to control the labor. Um, in 1948. Right. So, and what's interesting is that the mines actually started, the passes go way back. Mine owners wanted passes for the men who were coming from rural areas so they could control influx, outflux control. So there was some sense of not having a flood, but having it very controlled. Um, but 1913, they created this kind of strange land map, and then 1948, they really put pressure on it. So one thing you have to keep in mind, it's hard to force millions of people to go anywhere. So you can pass these laws, but actually implementing them takes years. And in fact, they were doing forced removals all the way up until the 80s, until the end of apartheid. Because you'd have a family that still lived here, right? Or a black family here. Like much of Africa, the demography of people to land, there's small populations in reference to the amount of land they actually have. So you could still have what they called black spots during apartheid. So I'm going to just, so when I look at that map, because what would happen is that if someone came out of here, let's say looking for a job in Bloemfontein, they could be stopped anywhere in this white area, and if they didn't have a pass that said they had a right to be there, they would be sent back here. So it's an interesting dichotomy, yet the folks in Bloemfontein needed labor. But there was such a gut with this kind of construction of people who slipped through the cracks and were so desperate that you had a huge labor supply even if you stopped some, because they're starving. These are not good land areas for agriculture. So they're starving, and so they're coming. So there's always a surplus of labor, even with the attempts to control and manage where they're supposed to be. So then I think about the fence along Mexico, U.S. border that folks have been attempting to construct. And it just struck me very similarly that the kind of situation, well, there's two things I think when I think about this. One is this reminds me very much like the barriers that those Bantustans created. So people weren't supposed to leave there unless they were working. So it kept people in, but it also, a situation was set up on the other side of the Mexican border, especially with NAFTA, that led to an element of starvation on the other side. So people are going to cross that fence. And they're being lured. Agricultural labor would not survive. So it's a very similar push and pull. You set up a situation where people are forced to come, they're invited to come, but then they can't have rights in the place where they work because they have to be regulated, tagged, and if they have rights, it's much more difficult to super exploit them. I think that's the thing. It's cheap labor, the underbelly of labor. Um, you know, yes. I just don't know exactly where in both cases. And you see, it doesn't go all the way because sometimes they use, it's not fully developed everywhere. Some of it is wood construction, some of it is metal with barbed wire. Some of it doesn't exist because it's mountainous. So it's so interesting to me that even the idea of constructing this border, given the fact that we wouldn't be able to eat if not for Mexican migrant workers who have been coming to this country for decades. Let me see. In 2006, 77% of all agricultural workers in the United States were foreign born. Um, and half of those foreign born workers were undocumented and continue to be undocumented. Being undocumented and being foreign born allows these workers to be paid less than other workers. So again, this kind of paradox of needing and wanting the labor, but wanting to control and regulate and keep it outside of the realm of citizenship and rights and power so that you can continue to super exploit. So there's so many images of migrant workers. I thought this sign was quite interesting. The other thing that's so interesting to me about this is we're in an era of globalization. We're in an era where borders don't matter to big business and capital. There, U.S. businesses are all over the Mexican side of the border. And America really works hard to be in every market in the world. So the national border only matters when it comes to cheap labor, because actually a part of the new immigration discussion is to continue to have a kind of smooth pathway to citizenship for those that are high skilled. But for cheap labor, you seem to want them and not want them and construct fences and borders, but for big capital, those borders don't exist. So then I wanted to, Arizona is not the only state that has passed these bills about illegal aliens. And I actually looked through the laws of Mississippi and Alabama as well as Arizona and found some really, really interesting things. This was passed, this is Mississippi House Bill Section 5, and it was passed, it's 488, House Bill 488. I didn't put it on my slide. And it was passed in July of 2012. And it says, an officer or private person may arrest any person without warrant for an indictable offense committed or a breach of the peace threatened or attempted in his presence, or when a person has committed a felony, though not in his presence, or when a felony has been committed and he has reasonable ground to suspect and believe the person proposed to be arrested have committed it. This is a part of the illegal alien bill, not a part of regular law. So therefore, if someone thinks someone is an illegal alien, any person, if they see or think something's happening, can actually do a citizen's arrest in Mississippi. Or on a charge made upon reasonable cause of the commission of a felony by the party proposed to be arrested. And in all cases of arrest without warrant, the person makes such an arrest must inform the accused of the object and cause of the arrest. It's legal jargon, except when he is in the actual commission of the offense or is arrested on pursuit. I just found this really interesting and dangerous. This is the only state that I saw that an average white citizen or black citizen or Mexican citizen or anybody could actually go up to somebody that they deem an illegal alien if they think they're doing something wrong. And I'm using the word alien here because that is the language in all of these bills, that they have a right to actually step up and try to arrest them. So it reminds me of the militias and slave patrols and all of that. Alabama, HB 56, says relating to illegal immigration to require a person to present proof of citizenship and residency before voting, to prohibit an alien unlawfully present in the United States from receiving any state or local public benefits. That's also school. There was another piece of this law that said that teachers had to check documents in Alabama, And if they didn't do it and couldn't show if they were audited that they hadn't done it, that actually the school could be, this is a public school, could be penalized. And it's because they're getting public benefits. They're part of the public system. To prohibit a person not lawfully present from being eligible on the basis of residence for education benefits, to require business entities to verify the employment eligibility of their employees, to require an illegal alien to possess certain documents already required by federal law, to prohibit an unauthorized alien from seeking employment in this state, to require the verification of the legal status of persons by law enforcement officers under certain circumstances, to criminalize certain behavior relating to concealing, harboring, shielding, or attempting to conceal, harbor, or shield unauthorized aliens, and to provide penalties. So that's if you have a friend who is undocumented and you don't turn them in or you shield them, you can actually be arrested in Alabama. So I had, how do I, Dante? I wanted to just play what I call a kind of final, kind of a report on where we are now. Just you can just click that, and it should come up, I hope.
There's a sense of urgency here, Betty. Speed is of the essence. On the economic side, look for the president to make the argument because he's getting pressure on that from the right and the left.
There are many other segments of our economy who are seeing that as our economy starts bouncing back, there's going to be that need for workers. And the time to try to deal with it is right now before those pressures are fully on us.
But on those low-tech jobs, the president, he has to navigate a difficult divide between the labor community and the business community. Remember, the business community, their big push is for those high-tech visas. All those CEOs that have been coming into the White House, that's what they're pressing on. And when you look at some of the numbers on that, they typically hit the quota 6 months into the year. This year, they did it just 10 weeks into the year. The current quota is at 85,000 high-tech visas. Back in the early 2000s, it was almost as high as 200,000. Now, the Senate plan, here are the basic details. It would give some 11 million undocumented immigrants in the U.S. an immediate ability to work legally and then a pathway to citizenship sometime in the future. Have assurances to protect American jobs. Betty, no details, you're right, but the president will be embracing the Senate framework. He won't offer any sort of specific proposal himself, but he'll call on Congress to act quickly. There's a sense of urgency here, Betty. Speed is of the essence. On the economic side, look for the president to make the argument because he's getting pressure on that from the right and the left.
There are many other segments of our economy who are seeing that as our economy starts bouncing back, there's going to be that need for workers. And the time to try to deal with it is right now before those pressures are fully on us.
But on those low-tech jobs, the president, he has to navigate a difficult divide between the labor community and the business community. Remember, the business community, their big push is for those high-tech visas. All those CEOs that have been coming into the White House, that's what they're pressing on. And when you look at some of the numbers on that, they typically hit the quota 6 months into the year. This year, they did it just 10 weeks into the year. The current quota is at 85,000 high-tech visas. Back in the early 2000s, it was almost as high as 200,000. Now, the Senate plan, here are the basic details. It would give some 11 million undocumented immigrants in the U.S. an immediate ability to work legally and then a pathway to citizenship sometime in the future. But senators, particularly Democratic senators, were quick to say that they would have assurances to protect American jobs.
We are going to enshrine in here the principle that when it comes to job openings, Americans get the first grab at it. Americans get the first opportunity, and that's the way it should be.
That's the challenge for the president's party. On the Republican side, the main difference is just how quickly do you give those 11 million undocumenteds legal citizenship? Betty, that means the right to vote. Some Republican strategists look at those 11 million and they see permanent minority status for their party.
Okay. I just think this is interesting. Shows some of the tensions. What Dick Durbin said is the average American is not going to be. So that is just lip service. I think it's interesting the worry that the Republicans have at the end is that if those 11 million people become citizens and can vote. So in many ways, a lot of this is about rights. It's about the ability to be heard, understood, to be cultural, to be, I mean, I don't know how many times you all have heard, well, some towns only have things in Spanish. Well, it's because you hire a lot of Spanish-speaking workers. But the idea that you can hire people and they don't bring their culture, their families, their desires, their desire for human rights, their desires for citizenship rights with them is a kind of dichotomy that I think is part of also what we're had, you know. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Okay. So comments, questions. I know it's kind of this kind of crazy putting together of a lot of things. It's provocative, good. There's a new book out actually by David Rodeker called Race and Labor Management. And it's very interesting because he coins a term whiteness as management. And says that a lot of folks who have looked at labor and the management of labor in this country have never looked at slavery or immigrant labor as the place where the most management actually happens. And he is attempting to rewrite that understanding and the role of race in labor management. It's it's a brand new book and it's quite interesting. Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, right, right. Well, you know, it's interesting. I know that in Cuba, everybody has a kind of book, which is a little different than a certain part of the population being segmented by a book. And in South Africa, only blacks had to carry passes, and here only slaves had to carry passes and badges. And now we have only Mexican. I mean, you know, I don't have to show my documents when I move around. I'm not in fear of being stopped for that either. although I haven't been to Arizona, Alabama, or Mississippi lately. So, hmm hmm. Hmm. You mean not well, Nazi Germany, but Soviet Union. Hmm hmm Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Well, that's racial. That's racial. Yeah, yeah, yeah. hmm hmm Yeah. It's very interesting. I will say, Chris Hani, who was a leader of the movement, the South African Liberation Movement, and was really poised to be Mandela's second. He represented the youth and had been in the military wing of the um, ANC while Mandela was in jail. And when Mandela gets out in 90 and they're doing negotiations between 90 and 94, Chris Hani was killed in 1993. What's interesting is that Chris Hani had trained some in the Soviet Union. And I remember, I actually knew him, and I remember him talking about not liking the past that he had to carry while in the Soviet Union because it was reminiscent of South Africa. Right, right. But I think, did everybody have to have it or only certain folks? Or do you know? I don't know the history. If you were traveling, you had to. Yeah, yeah. Anybody who traveled inside the country, yeah, because that's what, right. Yes, that's right. And that's one of the things I said that when I find these commonalities, I want to dig deeper and see, how we can theorize them and think about them. And so this is just the beginning of this kind of paper for me, and I want to work more and work harder to see different ways. Dealing with this sort of the ideology of white supremacy and then the desires for cheap labor and how they work together and sometimes come into conflict, I find very, very interesting. So that's what I'm kind of thinking about. Um, and because actually, I'll give you another example. In South Africa, Soweto, all those big townships, like Soweto outside of Johannesburg, everybody heard about the Soweto uprising. Soweto technically was illegal because it was in a white area. But even the apartheid regime didn't, sometimes they would make raids just to harass people and see who was legal and who wasn't to be there. But businesses in Johannesburg needed a Soweto nearby. They couldn't regularly get labor from so far away in the rural Bantustans. So it's just interesting to me that the apartheid regime set up a system that then it had to break its own laws in order to have access to cheap labor. Yet harass folks because they're illegal the entire time that they're there. Um, right, right. In the lead, right, right. And as I was saying, this is also the, thinking about ways in which we connect these histories builds the kind of solidarity that I think we need in this period. And so that's one of my, because every time I hear kind of that, and you hear it on all sides. We all have family members that say something about Mexicans, or if you're Mexican, you got family members that say something about blacks, and if you're white, they're probably talking about both of them. And we hear that a lot, and thinking about ways in which our history, which is often denied us. I mean, to create a new narrative of American history, of global history, that connects us, I think is really a part of the historian's task. So. The badges. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, the interesting thing is they're collector's items, and they're rare. They're rare, and I read about them when I was in Charleston at the Avery Center, and and saw some images there, and then you can go online, and they're there in auction houses. It Well, like a slave badge might be $2,000. I guess we can, yes. I haven't delved deep into that world, but I do know that because they're rare, they are collector's items, and they are auctioned off at various um, uh, places that actually auction off those things. So you can actually find some of those on just the images of them online. But I actually discovered the images when I was at the Avery Center in Charleston, which is kind of like Charleston Schaumburg. Um, so, but just perusing, you can actually, it's so interesting that it was in those collector spaces. Only reading, I had read about them, yes, yeah. But not a lot. There's not a lot of literature on early Charleston, actually. It's not a lot. So I'm very excited to do this work. And the early newspapers and all of that are available. Charleston has a really good, the archives is in Columbia, in the state capitol. I haven't been there yet. I've just been to the Avery Center. But they've preserved a lot of their history. And so, okay. Thank you very much.